I opened the project we created in the last lecture in WebStorm, the IDE I'm going to use throughout this course. Now WebStorm is only one option, and other great options as editors to work in this course would be Microsoft Visual Studio Code or editors like Sublime Text or the Atom editor. You can simply download them. All these options should be available for free and would allow you to follow along just like I do here. Now in this project you see a couple of folders and files were created, and that might look intimidating at the beginning, but most of the files you see here are only required for configuring the project, and the default configuration should be absolutely fine. The E2E folder will be required for end-to-end testing, something I won't dive into right now, and in the source folder, that is where you create your project. Now here we find even more files, but again, all these files here don't really have to be touched. Here you can simply, again, do some specific configuration for your project, also something we probably won't need. And most importantly, the index.html file is the single page our app is going to serve. But you don't need to change anything here. We're going to write all our code in the app folder. The assets folder could be used to store some static assets in your application like images, and the environments folder can be used for environment variables. If that's something which doesn't tell you anything, you probably don't need it here. And these are really just features you have available, since the CLI is there to help you with both simple projects when you just get started or build real big enterprise level applications once you get a little bit more experience. So it's the app folder which is important for us now. And if we go back to the page we created, we see app works here. Now app works, that is something we also find if we have a look at this app component.ts file. .ts for TypeScript. And again, we're going to dive deeper into this and see how exactly all these files here work together right at the start of the next section in the course, which we will reach shortly. If we have a look at this file though, we see app works here. And even if you don't fully understand the rest of this file, this seems to be what we see on the page. So if we change this to does this change ? And we hit save with, and that's important, ngserve still running, because that process needs to be running all the time, since it will watch your files for changes and automatically recompile them and reload your project in the browser. You should see, does this change in the browser without reloading it, since this ngserve window did this for you. So that seems to be the place where we can make a change, and this HTML page here probably also has something to do with it, because even though the text isn't to be found here, instead it is strange double curly braces thing here, we clearly see the h1 tag here. And if we go back to our application, to me, this really looks like a heading styled with a h1 tag. And we can confirm this if we inspect it in the Chrome developer tools. This is a h1 element containing the does this change text. So that seems to be what Angular does for us. And as a side note, this also shows you how Angular changes your HTML code, the DOM, at runtime. Because if you have a look at the page source, so what was downloaded from this development server spun up through ngserve, you see that here we don't have a h1 tag anywhere. We simply have this add root element here, something to which I will come back shortly, which seems to be responsible for loading our app, which then in turn seems to replace this content in the page with the content we define here in this app component HTML file. And that is indeed the case. In Angular, we use components to build our web application, and the app component is the one component with which we start, which defines what we see at the page we loaded the first time. Now let's change more about this page, and I'm going to use some feature in which we're going to dive deeper into later in the course. But let's say we want to add an input here, type text, to allow the user to enter some text, and then we simply want to output this right below the input. Now with normal JavaScript, you would have to manually set up a listener to any changes of the input value, get this value, and then somehow get access to this paragraph and output it there. Angular makes this really simple. All you have to do here is add square brackets with parentheses inside of them, and then ngModel in between. And again, we're going to learn what exactly that means. It's an Angular command, I can tell you that much. And then we can bind to name, let's say. So put name between double quotation marks. That sets up two-way binding, and it allows us to bind to a property of our app component TypeScript file, which is connected to the HTML file. You could say the HTML is what you see, and the TypeScript file is your business logic. So here we could remove this title property in this class. Classes are a TypeScript feature. You might know them from other object-oriented languages. And here we can now add a name property, which we initially set to an empty string, let's say. So name here and name in the HTML file. Now we set up a connection. And as mentioned before, we're going to have a closer look at this connection later. Now let's use the syntax we saw before with the double curly braces, which seems to simply output something to the template. And let's put name in between here too, referencing to this same property. Now, before we continue, I'll have to step in here real quick. In later or more recent versions of the CLI, you probably already noticed that the starting screen changed a little bit, but that is no issue. What is an issue though is that this code won't work out of the box anymore because one important import, which was added by default before, is now missing. But we can simply add it on our own. So we want to make ng-model work here. And as I said, you will later learn what exactly that is. Now, for it to work, we need to adjust something in our app-module.ts file though. So if we open that file, I will dive deeper into that in the next lectures. Basically here we unlock features we can use in our Angular app, you could say. And we need to unlock one specific feature to use that ng-model thing. Here, in imports, we need to add an import, and that is the forms module. So make sure to add this here in this imports array. And as you can see, I get an error because Angular would now theoretically know it, but TypeScript doesn't know which type that is. This is why we also have to add an import at the top. There, simply add import, curly braces, forms module from @Angular forms. And with that in place, now if you save this and you go back to your application, you should see what I see. And with that, back to the old video. All the other code still is the same. Angular didn't change. That was only a little CLI change and a change of the default project. And we go back to our application. We now see this input field and nothing else. But watch what happens if I type my name here. If I enter Max, you see it appear right below this input field and it updates with every keystroke. And if we inspect this here, we see it here on the right. And there you can also see how that gets changed dynamically. And this is exactly why you use frameworks like Angular. With only 2 lines here and 1 line here, you get something which would require more lines in vanilla JavaScript and more importantly, which is managed for you. So this connection we set up here with ng-model is now always managed by Angular, and even if you change some other code, that is something which will always update dynamically. And even if you were to change name somewhere else, let's say you add another input on another component which we're going to add later, it would still update this name here if you set up the right connection. And this is really what makes Angular awesome. It allows you to create very reactive applications which update the DOM reactively on every keystroke, for example, with just some lines of code here. Now, let's see what this course offers you before we then dive deeper into it and fully understand what we just did here.